Hi there, this is Alvin, and welcome to the Kickstart Commerce podcast, where we share search marketing and domain investing strategies to help grow your business. In today's episode, our guest is none other than Steve Webb, a jack of all trades, a master of what's important, and the man behind the man of the curtain as a researcher, developer, and marketer at Park.io, a backordering service for drop-catching expired ccTLD domains. Today, Steve and I discuss his journey into the domain industry, the hidden world of drop catching as it relates to the ccTLD ecosystem, how to appraise ccTLDs, and why .io domains are skyrocketing in price. We also discuss a bit about Park.io and their new back order service offering. And last but not least, we discuss how COVID has impacted Park.io and the domain industry in general. So with that, Steve, welcome, and thank you for making time to join us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited about this.
Exactly, man. We're excited to have you on. I'm excited to have you on for a couple of different reasons. Obviously, we're going to be talking about Park.io and just everything to do with ccTLDs. But as fate would have it, so Steve and I have actually had, I guess we would say, a former life together, actually the same life together, just 20 years ago. So this past, NamesCon 2020, so it was held here in Austin, Texas. Obviously, I reside in Austin, Texas, but Steve attended, and as time passed and things just happened along the way in terms of NamesCon, we kept eyeing one another in terms of going, man, it seems like I know that person, or rather, I do know that person. And so we kept kind of going back and forth, and I kept looking at him like, man, I think I know who he is, but I didn't want to be the guy of, actually trying to see his name badge. And especially how name badges fell, it's kind of like, well, I don't want to be the man looking at another man, if you get what I mean. That being said, we actually attended, I believe it was Mike Seiger's lunch of DN. I believe it was like a DN Academy lunch. And even as we walked down the street, I just remember thinking to myself, like, my goodness, why does this guy seem so familiar? And it wasn't until, I guess, was it the same day?
It's either the same day or the next, because I saw you. I actually saw it was in the GoDaddy talk. They either mentioned you or they put your name up on the projector. They did something very Alvin Brown specific, and it just clicked in my head, like, oh my God, I know that guy. I went to high school with that guy.
Exactly. And then I think we wound up meeting like in a lounge, and you walked up and you like, I know. And then as soon as you said, I know you, it all clicked for us in terms of being like, oh my gosh, like, yes. We spent years together, just 20 years prior growing up. So that's just kind of a interesting weaving of stories there. So, kick things off, Steve. I mean, one, welcome, but then briefly share at a high level with our listeners just a bit about yourself, who you are, your personal and professional background.
Yeah, so the last time you saw me, I was a Bearcat, Sherman High, repping Shertown, which is our big claim to fame for a long time. Was we had a sign in Dallas that said North 75, you can get to Sherman, which was actually replaced. And now the sign that we used to have, it points to McKinney. So the one kind of big thing we had going for us doesn't exist anymore. So after I left Sherman, I went to college, then grad school, did a lot of work in internet related type things, did a lot of like internet security type work at some startups. And then I actually went off to New Zealand for a while and did some crazy things, and then started an SEO consultant business. And that's, I think, probably whenever kind of everything started to merge as far as my background in internet security and doing like identifying web spam and looking at domains and kind of all these different things. And so then not too long after that, I met up with Mike Carson, and that's kind of how I segued into Park.io. And then that's really what we're going to spend probably the majority of the podcast talking about, is what I do there and kind of what drop catching is all about and what expired domains are all about. And then just kind of this interesting world of ccTLDs, which I think a lot of people have kind of a partial understanding of, but it's not nearly as kind of in your face as obviously the more popular .coms and .nets and those. And so, yeah, that's the kind of high level overview of where you left me before we re-met at NamesCon.
Where I left him, and yet here it is. I'm picking him back up again. So I guess for those who don't know who Mike Carson, you mentioned Mike Carson, but who is he? I guess in relation to Park.io.
So Mike Carson is, in my eyes, somewhat of a superhero, only because he started Park.io, I think in 2014, and in the very early days, it was more of just a hobby because for a long time, I mean, like a lot of us that are in the tech industry, we do a lot of these projects, we code up stuff, we do a lot of proof of concept, we're constantly launching things, some work, some don't. And what he quickly realized, like most of us, is that for all these projects, you have to have some kind of a home for them. And that means you have to have a domain for any one of these things that you're creating. And I forget the exact domain that he was interested in. I want to say it was something like smile.io or something, some very short, cute.io that he was interested in. He realized that it was going to become available soon, and he wanted to get it for his project, obviously. And in the process of doing that, I think he wrote some very early script that literally was just checking like every minute to see if it was available, and then it would send him an email. And so the story he tells is, I think he was sitting down to eat dinner with his wife, and he got this email that the domain had just become available. And so he like rushed to his computer, tried to register the domain, and he missed it. And he was just like beside himself, right? Because he felt like he'd already, written the script to try to find when a thing was going to become available. Like in his mind, he was like, I'm already doing, the work that most people aren't already doing. So like, I should be able to get this domain. And so that kind of empowered him to then really start going down the rabbit hole and figuring out like what is the actual process for like when these domains become available, and when do they actually drop, and what do I need to do to actually be competitive so I can actually get these domains so I don't miss the next smile.io. And so that started kind of this journey where he starts creating these scripts and getting better and better. And then, he got to the point where he was consistently getting pretty much every name he ever wanted. And so then he realized, well, I can't just have every single .io name. So I'll put it up as a service and see if other people are interested. And not surprisingly, a lot of people were, and then it kind of just took off from there. And so that was 2014 when he first launched, and then it progressively got bigger and bigger. But the reason I call him, a superhero in my eyes is, I mean, he ran it by himself for the larger part of 5 years. And then like we can get into kind of how he and I linked up, but until I came on board, I mean, he was a one-man army. And so I've got nothing but respect for him, because now for the past year, I've essentially taken over a lot of those things to free him up to do other stuff. But it's just, personally, I don't have kids. I don't have nearly the responsibilities that he does. And so the fact that he was able to do all of the things he was able to do for these 5 years was very impressive for me. And so I've got nothing but respect for him. And so, and then I'm now obviously his partner. So I'm in some ways incentivized to be an even bigger fan, but I was a big fan before I ever had any real affiliation with the site. And obviously, I mean, now that I really understand what goes on behind the scenes, I've got nothing but respect for him.
That is amazing. And I'm assuming then, in terms of, because when he started, IO really wasn't as popular as it is
Not
today.
at all. Yeah, I mean, it was.
So this was a shot in the dark.
In a lot of ways, yeah. I mean, so I don't know the exact history. Like, I can't even think what the biggest domains would have been back then. But I mean, we'll talk about some of the success stories kind of in recent months. It's night and day. I mean, so back then, I mean, pretty much with the exception of this, smile.io or whatever he was trying to get back then, you could have pretty much anything you wanted. And for, basically just a registration fee, not for any type of premiums. I mean, it was just like, hey, I have this idea. Let's see if it's available for .io. And in most cases, it was.
Man, and what's incredible about that, obviously, I'll say a shot in the dark, meaning that he came along at just the right time that startups literally begin, I guess, kind of tilting away or shifting in terms of their initial cash outlay into a domain. It was more about, hey, let's get the business up and going, and we'll use this cool domain .io. And it was likely just an alternative. I would imagine for a lot of the startups that I've seen using them. I mean, in most cases, most of the .ios that I started or were introduced into were more of gaming
Yeah.
sites than anything else. But to start where he started and to been at the place, that intersection in history where startups literally begin to buy these names, and he just so happened to be the guy who struck out and pioneered, his path into this specific ccTLD. I mean, that's like lightning in a bottle.
That's the exact phrase I would use. It's like lightning in a bottle because to your point, I mean, obviously he had pretty strong intuition. I think he would admit he had no idea it would have grown to what it's grown to as far as just the popularity of .ios today. I mean, I'm sure he knew it was going to get much bigger than it was, but I mean, he and I have conversations now where there are domains that are being resold today that he had, years ago, and it still never ceases to amaze how much things are progressing, even just from month to month. Not to mention, from 2020 versus 2014. And so,
And
yeah,
so,
I mean, there's a lot to be said for being in the right place at the right time, and he absolutely was.
and speaking of right place, right time, I mean, obviously, right place, right time for us to meet back up, but you're not too shabby yourself in terms of impeccable timing.
I agree. I mean, so this is definitely that's the thing. I mean, so when people talk about just the domain industry in general, to me, even though I mean, when you look at some of these IO prices, even in .co and some of the others we'll talk about, like there's definitely been some increases, obviously, as far as the pricing. But even with those, if you take that aside, in my eyes, ccTLDs in general still represent kind of that new frontier, right? Like if you were looking for where is the biggest opportunity in the domaining industry, in my eyes, it's very much ccTLDs because a lot of the .coms, as we know, the really great ones have already been taken. There's still lots of opportunities in .io and even the more popular ccTLDs. But then the less popular ones now, in a lot of ways, is just like the ground floor. So like .gg, for instance, is kind of known as like the gaming TLD, right? So if you're an
Right.
esports team or an esports league, in a lot of cases, you'll actually opt for the .gg as opposed to a .com just because it's becoming this very established community of what GG is all about. And GG, just for people that aren't into gaming, GG stands for good game, and so that's kind of the cutesy reason why people have rallied behind .gg because it's a very nice kind of very gamer centric way to market your domain as hey GG.
Right, right. And so that's interesting. So then I guess share a little bit about how did you cross paths with, Park.io? And I mean, it's just kind of one of those things that I look at and I go, man, as much as Mike had impeccable timing, shoot, it seems that both of y'all just seem to have
Yeah.
have the Midas touch in terms of showing up at the right place at the right time in history.
So so originally, I mean, I will get into the full story, but I I at various times in my life have decided to just kind of check out on life. And so like once I spent a year in New Zealand. Everybody thought I was crazy. It's probably the smartest thing I've ever done. I did a similar thing. I guess it was 2018, 2019. I checked out and I backpacked all around Europe. And so when I got back, I was like really motivated because I'd been doing SEO and digital marketing for almost a decade at that point, like doing the consulting and kind of grinding it out with all these different consulting engagements. And so when I got back from Europe, I was basically just looking at the landscape of like, what do I want to do next? Like, what's really
Right.
interesting? What kind of directly relates to what I've done in the past and like what my background really jives with. And just kind of by luck, I had a friend who was really jazzed up by Park.io. I think he had just gotten an account on Park.io maybe like a month or two prior to when he talked to me about it. And he had bought like a ton of these .io, like because what a lot of people obviously in domaining do is there's a lot of speculation. You obviously don't know. I mean, there are certain domains where it's pretty well 100% guarantee it's going to go up in value. But then
Right.
there's lots of them where you just have like for whatever reason you like the words, you think, it directly relates to something you're really interested in, or it has some relation to some other type of brand that's getting big or some other, niche. And so that's what my friend had done. Like he had bought, like, I don't know, 20 or 30 domains just kind of on a hunch of like, oh, I just really like these keywords and they're available. And Parkio is really addictive, to be honest with you. I mean, because we're very good at what we do. And so if you find a domain you like, in all likelihood, we're going to get it for you. And so my friend just kind of went on this binge of just like, he bought all these domains. And then he got really excited about just the industry in general, because he realized, like, if this is exciting for me, that's clearly going to be exciting for other people. This is a great industry. We should get into it. And so then he kind of reached out to me and was like, hey, we should look into this. And so we then actually approached Mike about potentially buying Park.io. And, I won't like bore you with all the details because this becomes just like this multi-week saga. But my friend actually ended up kind of bailing on me. And at that point I had gotten to, like, it started out, he was really excited. He had seen, or he'd listened to all these podcasts that Mike had done, and he was like super excited about the domaining industry. He had gotten me super excited about it. So then when he pulled out, I was just like, I don't want to pull out. Like, I'm really into this. Like, I want to continue. Like, you got me super excited, and now you're going to pull the rug out from under me. And so Mike and I kind of continued talking, and we figured out, how to make it work. And so then I officially became a partner, I guess, back in June of 2019. So it's just recently been my 1-year anniversary. And originally, so this is kind of going back to my background in SEO, I had pitched him kind of, I'm going to be basically like your new marketing guru, right? Because he kind of famously hasn't really done a lot of marketing for Park.io. I mean, like, and he just because he had out of no real need, right? Like, as soon as he launched, literally on day one, he had orders. And then the primary way he's marketed it since 2014 is just putting up parked pages for the domains that we've been able to acquire. And then through word of mouth, I mean, it's just grown year over year. And so when I saw that, like, 'cause that's the thing, I mean, I was attracted to the opportunity just as a standalone opportunity, like without looking at, the nuts and bolts of the company and the financials and whatever. And when I realized that he hasn't really done any marketing, I just, like, the light bulb went off, like, hey, there's a huge opportunity here to get this in front of people that aren't necessarily aware of how great the service is and what the opportunity is for the domaining industry in general, and then specifically the ccTLD industry. And so everything aligned for me. I mean, I was very excited. So, like, I feel very blessed that Mike was even willing to, humor me and continue talking and figure all this out, because I would have been pretty disappointed, I think, if it had all fallen apart last year.
Certainly, and Mike is not really he's not really an extrovert. He's more of an introvert.
He actually has a company called introvert.com, just to highlight just how introverted he is.
Oh man, he is he's the guy that likely goes to the conferences and is in the room before dinner.
I'll give him credit. I mean, he did a really good job at NamesCon. I think knowing how introverted he is, I feel like he put on a really, like, brave extrovert face. I mean, because he was out in the sessions. I mean, yes, I do think that he probably went back to his room a little earlier than some, but because the really funny story is, up until NamesCon, we'd never met in person. Like, we did all of that.
Wait a minute.
All of that over the phone and via emails and everything.
No,
Yeah.
I don't believe it. You're not going to tell 100%. Me something that y'all didn't meet in person before striking up a partnership.
We were successfully partners for 6 or 7 months without ever actually meeting in person, which again just kind of highlights the world we live in 2020. But especially now, right? I mean, like, it would have been out of necessity if it was happening in our current era of COVID craziness. But back then, we actually were allowed to see people on a regular basis and not have to worry about having hazmat suits. And even in that context, we still didn't. In fairness, I mean, I live in Texas, he lives in Philadelphia, so it was a little challenging to meet in person, but it could have been done. It's just, I think both of us tend to be more online centric anyway. And so, I mean, I only bring it up because up to that point, he had kind of conditioned me to think that he was super introverted. And so when I met him at the conference, I was kind of like, well, you're doing way better than I was expecting, right? Like, I mean, you made it seem like you were going to not even leave the hotel room. And so I feel like you did a great job. but yes, he is on the whole very introvert. Although, I mean, I go back and forth. I don't know. You catch me on the right day, I'm more extroverted. Like right now, I'm
Exactly.
feeling pretty good. So we'll see if we can
Exactly.
continue the flow.
Certainly. So then let's talk a little bit about the world of drop catching as it relates to, the ccTLD ecosystem, which is just it's a total different animal when in comparison to .com.
Oh yeah,
And so, and for those that are not familiar with ccTLDs, it's what is it? Country
country
code top
code. Yeah.
level top level domains. Yeah. So country code top level domains, ccTLD. So those are more of your, what is it? 2-letter country codes,
Yep. Pretty much
that
for the most
have,
part, any two-letter code you'll come across is going to be a ccTLD.
right. And in most cases, they represent, or they're the abbreviation of, I guess, what, a country,
Yeah.
for the most part. But some of those have basically gone on to become hacks in some cases, like .ws. So if you put any .ws, obviously then you have news. So it's a hack. Or think about the old service Delicious.
Yep.
It's a hack, and there are other Paperly. There are so many different ones that are out there that are hacks. So, I mean, kind of get us clued in a bit, Steve, just on the hidden world of drop catching and how it all works in terms of the ccTLD ecosystem.
Okay. So, like you mentioned, I think hacks is probably the way that I was first introduced to them. So I forget exactly when .us was created, and this is funny. I mean, like everybody kind of has those like, oh, I wish I had done this or that or whatever moments. And when .us was first created, I remember I generated some program that like went out and identified every hack I could think. Like it basically just dumped the dictionary and spit out every available .us domain. And unfortunately, I was a poor and very dumb college student, and so I didn't actually read. Like I did the hard work of actually identifying like these hundreds of what would now be super valuable domains. But then at the time, I was like, oh, I can't afford these like paltry registration. I mean, if you add it all up, it would have been what, a few $1,000s maybe, which
Right.
doesn't seem like a lot, but for a college student was like an insurmountable sum. Which again, in retrospect, terrible decision on my part. But anyway, like so .us is kind of how I first got introduced to this notion of hacks and ccTLDs. And you mentioned Delicious. Like for the longest time, I think Delicious is probably the most famous domain hack, which they unfortunately like kind of switched teams and they went to the .com. But for the longest time, they were repping the home team and staying true to the ccTLD world. But I guess the biggest difference, as you mentioned, between like the .coms and the .orgs and .nets versus the ccTLDs from the drop catching perspective is you have a lot more diversity as far as the registries. So as we talked about, so the CC and ccTLD is country code. And what I think a lot of people don't understand is those domains are in fact in some way or another associated with these countries. So like .co is probably one of the most famous ccTLDs, and it's kind of been co-opted, right? Like people don't think of it as a Colombian ccTLD; they think of it as just an abbreviation of company. So if you can't get the .com, you get the .co because it's basically like the 2.0 version of company. But what people don't understand is that that is actually associated with Colombia as a country, and so there is everything you can imagine that's associated with that, all the geopolitical issues, because the Colombian government gets a piece of it in one way or another. I mean, I don't know the
Right.
exact agreements for every single one of them, but suffice to say, every single ccTLD has its own unique story. So .io is also kind of its own really unique animal because IO stands for Indian Ocean. They're
Hmm.
actually like associated with these islands that are out in the in the middle of nowhere basically, but it's essentially owned by the British government. It's very very interesting. And there's this dispute with the indigenous people of the Indian Ocean Islands, and
Right.
it's all like, and so every one of these countries has a similar type of crazy story, and that just adds to kind of the intricacies associated with these ccTLDs. Because in any ccTLD, I mean, just to back up for a second, all of them basically have the same essential life cycle, right? Like you have a domain, it's active for some period of time as long as somebody owns the registration for it. And then if you don't renew and the registration expires, it goes into a period, or it goes into a couple of different states where it can be renewed even though it's already expired. And then after it passes through kind of this redemption phase, it enters into a pending delete phase. And so we don't have to worry about the nitty gritty of the different phases, but pretty much every domain within the most popular TLDs follows that life cycle to some extent. But in addition to all that, you have to recognize that each of these ccTLDs has their own individual registry, which again is associated with the country. And so
Right.
all of them have this life cycle you have to deal with in order to figure out like when it becomes actually available and when you can actually register it. But then if you want to actually do that, right, if you want to be a registrar that's able to actually register one of these domains on behalf of registrants, you have to go through all the red tape essentially that's associated with the registries and the countries that are connected to the registries. And it's a wild situation because like .com it's managed by is it Veritone?
Yeah, VeriSign.
Yeah, VeriSign, sorry. I can't remember. I don't think they actually own. We were talking about this the other day. It's a really weird relationship because it's not clear if VeriSign actually owns the TLD or if they just manage it.
Right.
But regardless, they own or they manage .com, .net, and at least a couple, and I think .tv, .cc. But they're a massive company, and so they handle all of those registrations, and so you get somewhat of a universal interface with those people, right? Like so, I mean, with those TLDs. So if you want to do anything in the TLDs that VeriSign owns, it's somewhat standardized, right?
Right.
You don't get that benefit if you're talking about .ly or .to or .ai or .cco. Like it's a completely
Wild,
different
Wild
animal
West.
for every single. Exactly, it really is. Like it's, which is, I mean, it depends on how your perspective, right? Like from my perspective, it's extremely exciting because there's never a dull moment. You're having to deal with different people all the time in terms of making these things work. From an end consumer standpoint, probably not as exciting because they would much prefer it be more like VeriSign, where it's just like I go to one place and I'm done. Like I just want my domain. I don't want to deal with the hassles of making it all work behind the scenes. And so it's wild. Like I had an inkling of how crazy it was before I got involved in all this. Now it's a completely different situation. Like now that I've been able to look behind the curtain, it is you said ecosystem. That's a great way to describe it because it's a very constantly in flux, never really stable situation which is not to say, I mean, if you own a ccTLD, it's fine. Like from an end consumer standpoint, there's no real concern. Like you're going to be fine. But from a registrar perspective, there are constantly things that are changed that you have to stay abreast of in order to continue to be competitive if you're trying to drop catch or just to make sure that you're abiding by whatever restrictions they put in place at the registry level, at the the individual country level.
And technology, I guess technology from registrars, probably as well as registries, isn't always embraced either, right?
No. So that's the other, so EPP is kind of the definitive protocol that's used for most registrars to registries. And again, when I say that, I mean like with the really big boys, right? So like with the .coms, the .nets,
Right.
.org, like the most popular TLDs, it's universally recognized that you're going to be using EPP and it's really simple protocol. I mean, it uses XML. It basically just allows you to provision, which one of the P's is provisioning, I believe, just domains. Like it essentially allows a registrar to say to the registry, hey, I want to create this domain, or I want to renew, or I want to transfer, all the things that an end user would want to do with their domain. EPP is kind of the glue that makes it all happen between the registrars and the registries. Unfortunately, as you can imagine, some of the registries for ccTLDs don't use EPP. They have a completely own system that either they've written themselves or has been kind of grandfathered in from years and years ago when they first stood up, the registry.
Smoke signals.
So again, exactly. So, I mean, the joke, in some cases, it's not that far off. Like, I fortunately haven't had to deal with some TLDs that have been really far back. But Mike has told me stories of where, like, he literally had to, like, use faxes to get certain things done, which you can just imagine in 2020. I mean, fortunately, we're not going to do it in 2020, but in the lifetime of Park.io, he has had to do certain operations via fax, which you can imagine is incredibly inefficient when you're trying to run a registrar and you're trying to deal with end user needs.
And that's just crazy to think about how far we've come in technology. Yet, even you would think, I mean, a .co, a .cc, a .I, it isn't too far from the legacy TLDs. Like, what are we doing? But yet, it seems what seems to be a 20 to 30-year gap in technology at times, depending on who it is that you're dealing with and what it is that you're purchasing in terms of the ccTLD. And so, I mean, it's interesting in terms of the ecosystem, but then, so how does this impact in terms of like the ecosystem in terms of just drop catching? Because if we know that in terms of, hey, registrars going out or end customers going out to buy from registrars and technology may or may not be used, I mean, that certainly probably impacts how well you can actually drop catch certain or given ccTLDs.
Oh, absolutely. And so there's two things really. I mean, so the first, well, just to underscore one point I was trying to make about the ccTLDs, there is some degree of chaos, but fortunately it is completely behind the scenes for end users, right? Because
right,
it makes our job very difficult, but fortunately we kind of patch over a lot of these problems so that users never have to see them, right? So like if I'm having a terrible day, me as, Steve Webb having to deal with a registry, it's so that users don't have to have bad days if they want to deal with their, whatever ccTLD they're dealing with. But to your point with the drop catching, the technology, like where the technology becomes a real issue, and this has happened in two specific cases recently, is drop catchers are not particularly like good net citizens, right? Like our job is to just bombard servers with requests in order to be the first one to try to get one of these domains, right? Especially for the very valuable domains, which we'll get into. And so for a lot of these registries, right? Like if you're already kind of struggling to deal with just normal everyday operations, the last thing you want to deal with is these registrars that are just killing your server. I mean, just absolutely bombarding you with traffic in order to register these high value domains, or to them, not necessarily high value, but for the end consumer market, high value domains. And so to my knowledge, so .ai, it's just a really interesting use case because .ai is becoming this artificial intelligence
right,
base, right? Like if you're an AI startup, you absolutely want a .ai domain. And I think it's Anguilla is the actual country that's associated with .ai. And so originally, like that, what I just described is what happened is like Mike and some other guys that were trying to register .ais were just killing their servers. And they basically said, look, this isn't worth it. Like we can't deal with having to do the maintenance involved with keeping these servers able to handle all this traffic. And so they basically decided to kill drop catching because they just didn't want to deal with the headache, which was actually somewhat beneficial for Mike and I because Park.io actually runs the .ai auctions for them. Like our auctioning platform is what's used for the .ai domains. And so it works. It's great for them because they don't have to deal with, drop catchers constantly just destroying their servers.
right.
It's great for us because, we obviously get to partner with them and help them run their premium AI auctions every month. And so it's totally win-win. Like they don't have to deal with the headaches, and we still get to be involved and continue to kind of expand into really popular ccTLDs.
And if I remember correctly, I mean, the .ai infrastructure was impacted some years ago due to, I can't remember what exactly or which hurricane it was that hit, but they were down for some time because they're in the path. I mean, they're literally in the path of if there is a hurricane path to be in, they are in that path.
Yeah. So I know I remember what I can't remember the exact date either, but yeah, you're absolutely right. And that's the thing. I mean, which is also, I guess, the benefit of having the structure the way it is, as far as having these registrars kind of on top of the registry. It helps to a certain extent to solve some of those problems. I mean, obviously, if the registry's down, nothing can be done. Like you can't do the operations that need to be done. But if they're not time critical, I mean, there's lots of things that can be done at the registrar level to at least give them a break so that they're not just being totally out of business if something like that happens. Because fortunately, I mean, and that's taking it back a step. there are some ccTLDs that are very exclusive. So like LY, for instance, I don't think people know you have to actually be in Libya to register .ly domains. Like we have a relationship with one of the registrars in Libya, as that's how we're able to do it. But there are lots of countries that will not allow you to register unless you have a physical presence.
In China? China one of those, like .cn?
So we don't do China, so I'm not sure. But I mean, it wouldn't surprise me. Like I would actually probably expect China more than any to be like that, just because they're, have their own very restrictive beliefs about the internet just in general.
Right.
But yeah, like if you're not one of those situations though, right? So if you're, so like .io is a great example. I mean, Affiliates owns .io, and they're not kind of beholden to this physical location. But if you are a country that has a similar type of risk associated with it,
right,
if you have registrars that are all over the globe, that helps again kind of distribute the load and helps to prevent any one of these like really cataclysmic type events, like a hurricane or any other type of natural disaster.
Interesting. So then, kind of shifting gears here. So that's the ecosystem kind of at a high level, as well as, I mean, we didn't really do a deep technical dive, but I mean, we got deep enough to really understand that not every ccTLD is equal per se, for a number of reasons. But then let's talk about getting into how to appraise ccTLDs. I mean, obviously in .com, I mean, I don't know that there really is a rule of thumb across all domains for how to really appraise a domain. I mean, obviously we can get into some, I guess you'd say, rule of thumbs but they really don't carry a tangible value. Things like making sure that a domain passes the radio test. I mean, those things I call them the niceties. It's like, yeah, they'll keep you probably out of the ditch, but in terms of actually adding a dollar figure to it, that's just going to be hard to tell. So, I mean, how does one go about appraising, ccTLDs?
It's a really interesting problem, right? Like, I think, unfortunately, like you just mentioned, it's a very challenging problem in .coms and, even more popular TLDs. And it's significantly more challenging for ccTLDs. But so let's just focus on .coms just for a second, and then we'll see kind of how to make transitions. So in .com, like you mentioned, I mean, there's lots of rules of thumb. There's lots of kind of heuristics. Ultimately, I mean, for all of these TLDs, right? Like, what you're able to get is what it's worth, right? Like, because unfortunately, also, even if it's, because there's so many different unique situations for, like, I've got this company that just has to have it, and so therefore I'm willing to pay 10 times what I would if I was a rational human being. Like, there's lots of things that kind of throw these things out of whack. But on the whole, if you look at like every transaction that's happened for each of the TLDs, you can get at least some kind of a semblance of order as to what a real valuation would be. So in .com, you have a much better chance of doing that purely by virtue of the fact that there are literally millions of .coms that have passed hands one way or the other, right? Like whether it's public sales, resells, whatever, you have so many data points to try to figure out at least some sense of what a given .com might be worth. Maybe you might be lucky enough to have plenty of past data for just that .com itself, right? Like if you had, dogs.com, it's likely that dogs.com it probably hasn't changed hands recently, but for a lot of .coms, you'll have direct comps for that particular keyword. And so you can use that to at least get a sense for what it might be worth. And you can do lots of games like that. You can do lots of comp, like there's kind of different schools of thought, right? Like there's some people that are very heavy on the comp version. There's lots of people that are more kind of inclined to look at like characteristics of domains, whether it's, the traffic associated with the keywords or like the cost per click or other kind of what I would call off domain signals that help you get a sense for what the actual word might be worth, and then try to figure out how much the domain is worth based on, search traffic and cost per click and all those things. If you take all of that, right, like, and then come to the ccTLD world, it gets way dicier only because you don't have the virtue of all that data. Like, whereas in .com, you have millions of data points. For .io, which is probably the most popular, I guess .co probably has the most data points.
Right.
For our purposes, .io is kind of our bread and butter, even though we are now entering in the .co, it's a lot more challenging to figure out what it's actually worth because you don't have the benefit of all these past sales. And a lot of the sales that happen in ccTLDs are private, so you don't even though it's a very active community, you don't have nearly as much data. And so the short answer is we try to do the similar type of analysis, but then factor in, the dilution factor, right? Like if I know what, dogs.com would be worth, I don't know why I keep using dogs. I guess I'm a dog person. So anyway,
they're getting traffic.
well, there you go. So if you figure out how much dogs.com is worth, then you can try to get a sense for like, how do I scale that to a .io or a .co, right? Like it's not a perfect way to do it, but
right.
You tend to have better results doing it that way just because it is way easier to figure out how much a .com might be worth based on all those metrics I was mentioning. Just because, again, there's so much data, it's so much easier to kind of put it in its proper place within the .com world and then scale it into one of these other ccTLDs.
Right.
.io and .co, I mean, you do have data points. So if in a lot of cases, you will be able to find the exact one that you're looking at in previous sales, and then you can kind of get a better sense for that specific domain. But if you're talking about a domain in a ccTLD that's never had a publicly available sales data point, then you basically just have to start playing games like that, where you make your best estimation in a .com or a .net or whatever, and then try to scale it down. And you can do a number of ways, right? Like you can just kind of take an arbitrary factor, like I'll just divide it by 10, or I'll divide it by 5, or there are smarter ways to do it, but the quick and dirty way to do it is just very much, it's just like whenever you try to evaluate a company, right? Like if you're trying to put an evaluation on a company you want to acquire, there are very tedious ways you can do, like by looking at future cash flows and like all this kind of really hardcore financial analysis, or you can just look at the revenue and just take a multiplier, right? Like there's different avenues that are, some are more intense, some are quick and dirty. So it really is kind of up to you, like how much time you want to spend figuring it out. But the short answer is it's very difficult to get a really good answer. And the other thing that's complicated, as we mentioned at the beginning of this, it's constantly changing, right? Like, I mean, .io today is significantly more valuable than it was 5 years ago. And so you have to factor that in as well, right? Like if you see that it was sold in 2015 for X amount of dollars, you have to factor in the fact that 2020.io is not the landscape of 2015.ios. And so you have to definitely inflate it to get a sense of what it might actually be worth today.
So that's interesting because it makes me think about, as you were talking, I was just thinking about some of the sales that I just, stumbled up on just on social networks, Twitter, LinkedIn, the like. And what I realized, one in particularly was jackpot.io through Bar. I believe his name is Bartek. And
He's a Park.io user.
Yeah. And so, man, this dude, if you, I believe his Twitter handle is like PPC Bar. But go look up PPC Bar on Twitter. And I mean, it seems like the guy is buying .ios, if not every day, every other day, at least once or twice a week.
Oh yeah. There are some power users out there. And that's the thing, like when we talk about opportunity, there are definitely still lots of opportunities, but especially I'd say in the last 6 months, especially, what we're seeing is a lot of people that are like big names in the .com industry are finally kind of waking up to the opportunities in the ccTLDs, and primarily just because, I mean, the entry points are so much lower, right? Like if you're used to spending 6 figures for some .coms and you can get similar type quality in the ccTLDs for a fraction of those prices, like it's a no-brainer, right? I mean, like you can get so many more domains, and then by virtue of just having a much bigger portfolio, you end up having more like lottery tickets, that's how I would characterize it. And so a lot of people have kind of woken up to this idea that I can get a significantly larger portfolio of the ccTLDs that are still very high valuable keywords, and then obviously have many more opportunities to hit big on them. And Bar, like you mentioned, is one of the guys that is really big in the IO community, has a lot of great domains. And then, Jackpot, I think it sold for almost 50 grand. So
yeah, well, and that was the thing. It wasn't just 50 grand. It was 50 grand. And as far as I'm concerned, or remember, or recollect, is it was paid out in Bitcoin. I think
it was five Bitcoins, I think.
Yeah, so which was like 40, I think he reported 45,000 BTC. And so that in and of itself, I mean, that's just when you think about, okay, well, what would jackpot.com be worth? I don't know. I mean, I would, to a certain extent, if I'm looking at that 45 BTC, then I might say something like, okay, well, cash wise, it's probably worth 4.5 million. And that's still too low.
Yeah.
But if I'm, at least trying to compare, because then I look at something like, well, voice.com sold for 30 million. But what would voice.io sell for? I don't know. I mean, is it a percentage of that 30 million or, what is it?
So it's complicated, right? Because you have to take into effect like how developed is the domain. So like if you're talking about just voice.com with nothing associated with it, like, you're just talking about the domain, then that's obviously a little bit easier of a comparison.
Mm-hmm.
But if we're talking about, like a fully developed voice.com where they have, I don't know, like a voiceover service, or I don't know what would be on a voice.com, but if you have a fully kind of functioning service company on top of just the domain, that kind of makes it a much more difficult comparison. But to your point, yeah, I mean, and what's great is, so Amar Kuba is another kind of really big name in domaining, and also in I mean, he's big in all of TLDs, but especially in .io. He had a really great interview, I want to say in like last year, because he bought exo.io for
I
almost 20,
remember.
like and that's resale, right? So like wholesale value of about 20 grand. And I think he was interviewed by like Elliot on domain investing, and he had this great explanation. I mean, he's like, because he did basically what you're doing, right? He said, look, .exo.com, or sorry, exo.com, I want to say it's probably worth what, like 2.5 million. I don't remember exactly what numbers he was using, but he broke it down that like, look, I could easily sell that for 2.5 million. So what, like if I buy exo.io for 20 grand, like we're talking what, 1%, 2%
Right.
of that value. I mean, like, and that's today. I mean, obviously the expectation is it's going to grow over time. And then, if even if he doesn't develop the site, like there's a huge room for him to be able to get out from under that domain at a huge profit. And so it's just like, again, it kind of underscores that point that there's lots of opportunity, even for a at first glance kind of like a crazy number, right? Like if you see exo.io being sold at wholesale for 20 grand, like you're going to do a double take. But then when you really start to do the numbers, you realize, yeah, even at that number, like that's still a pretty good deal. Like there's still lots of room for a return on investment eventually for that. And in most cases, I mean, again, I don't want to give the impression that all the .ios are going for 20 grand at wholesale. I mean, that is the anomaly. Most IOs are still like a premium .io is still in the like low four, so like 1,000, 2,000. And in most cases, you can still get a lot of great .ios for $99, a couple $100. Like there's still lots of opportunity. It's just, it is definitely getting more pricey.
So okay, what is driving this price? Why are we seeing .io domains, be skyrocketing in price?
So I think it's a couple. I mean, the best analogy I like to use, and I don't know if I stole this from Mike or not, but we very commonly talk about TLD. Well, so we actually launched this whole other thing called Gateway.io that we can talk about at the tail end of this. And it's really very TLD specific. And so I think that's where we started really talking about this idea of TLDs being like neighborhoods. But that's how I think about it, right? So like if you're a .com, think of it as, I mean, neighborhood might be too small because .com obviously has millions and millions of sites, but it's very much like, either a city or a neighborhood or, a part of town or whatever. And if you think of .com, they put up bigger and bigger houses. They've put up like these massive gates. Like the properties have just gone up and up and up to the point where if I'm an end user or I'm a startup or I'm somebody that doesn't have a multi-million-dollar budget on a domain, I can't get into that neighborhood, or like I can't move to that city. Like if
Right.
it's like the cost of living of living in Manhattan, right? Like I don't have the funds to get a penthouse in Manhattan, but I might have the funds to get a penthouse in like Atlanta or or Dallas or Austin. It's still not necessarily cheap, but it's significantly less expensive than what I would be paying if I was going to get into this .com neighborhood. And in the early days, like we were talking about at the beginning of this, in 2014, when Mike was first starting the site, I mean, we're talking about not Austin or Dallas prices. We're talking about, Sherman prices or,
We're talking about how.
Yeah, exactly. And nobody gets that except for those
for us
in Texoma, but still, that's fine. As long as we get it, that's all that matters. But yeah, and so if you think about, if you carry that analogy out,
right,
as more and more people started like buying up, this real estate in these less expensive neighborhoods, those neighborhoods started to become more and more expensive. They started putting up bigger and bigger houses. So like when started to become successful and they put up these cool services on these .ios, people started to realize like, oh wow, like, you mentioned games earlier. Like there's like Gartic.io and there's like these
Slither.
Slither. There's all these like those were kind of more niche, but like Swipe.io is I think one of the biggest .io transactions that ever happened. And I think they do like either credit card processing or it's the same thing, right? Like there was some startup, they wanted to have a really sexy name. They didn't have the funds to buy the .com. And they said, well, look, am I going to spend $10 million on the .com right now whenever I might not even be a funded startup yet?
Right.
Or do I buy this .io now, invest all my money in actually building the service that I'm trying to build and actually getting customers and, doing the actual business of building the business. And then maybe I'll worry about the .com if I hit it big. Like if we have an IPO and then now we're just flush with cash, then maybe I'll circle back and try to get this really expensive .io or .com or whatever the case may be, but usually .com. And so that's, I think, naturally what has happened over this past 5 years for .io and .co. And it's interesting. We talked about the timing aspect of like when Mike got into this. I think all of these factors just kind of collided at the same time, right? Like .com really got out of control, in my opinion, as far as just some of the valuations, right around the same time that startups were looking for more of an online presence. And so it made sense for them to try to branch out. And the other thing, and I think we've talked about this kind of offline, is you don't really, I mean, there's a lot of marketing value associated with a .com. Like I'm under no illusion that a .io is somehow magically more recognizable than a .com, right? Like I would obviously prefer a .com as far as just the core brand recognition, and most average internet users by default are just going to put the .com because they just don't know any better, right? So there's clearly value in that. But as you find, I mean, like if you look at Chrome especially, every year they're trying more and more to get rid of the URL bar, right? Like where they don't necessarily even care about what the actual address is. Right. They just want you to go through the search engine, right? Like if you're Google, I want your entry point to be Google. And at that point, if I can rank with a .io just as well as a .com, which I can if I know what I'm doing, there's no real reason for me to pay a premium for a .com whenever I could get a really sexy .io. And then the user in a search result, all they're going to see is the keyword .io, and they'll be like, oh, okay, well, it's great. And they're just not going to care because they got there through the search engine, right? Like they didn't have to physically remember to put the .io or the .co or .me or whatever.
Right. And I think probably the biggest concern that I see in terms of if we're answering the question, well, should a business make the investment or make the jump from .io to .com or .whatever to .com, the biggest risk at play is whether or not that given domain gets into the hands of your competition. And so one of the things, like one of the examples that come to mind to where it makes sense and it's a solid domain is catch.io. So I actually interviewed the CEO of Catch, Kristen Anderson, roughly a couple months ago about catch.io. And she told the story about how they wanted catch.com. But Apple owns catch.com and they didn't have Apple money to be able to go buy catch.com. But she said, we built on catch.co based upon the fact that what's the likelihood that Apple is going to build a service that really focuses on taxes, benefits, health benefits, and everything like that? It's likely not going to happen. So she felt confident in staying put in terms of building on that catch.co, knowing that, well, the likelihood of it falling into the hands of someone else I mean, they'll take their chances with Apple selling that to someone else versus actually owning it. Whereas in some cases, let's just say it's $150,000 for that .com, and they're looking at a .io. In certain cases, it makes more sense to go pay the $150,000 because that is well within reach. Well within reach, considering all things, and that's relative, obviously, in terms of you got to look at what that given market is. I mean, if we're talking about, babysitters, probably somebody's not going to pay $150,000.
Yeah.
But if it's tech,
Well, I don't know. It depends on which baby. Like you're babysitting like Elon Musk's kids, maybe.
yeah, and I go, and that's the dead giveaway. It's more of a, is this a high end or is this a low end service? If it's a lower end service, there is no reason to move from it. But if it's a higher end service where there's likely the case that folks with deep pockets could come in and buy it, and here it is, you've built this, multi-million dollar business on a .io, yet you're leaking traffic over to the .com. I mean, it very much reminds me of the O.co or overstock.com situation of where they, reportedly lost like 61% traffic leakage by using a .co that leaked over to the .com, and they end up going back, over to overstock.com because they didn't own O.com. And so it's all these different things, but I think it comes down to, really, for me anyway, the bigger thing that folks have to be aware of: email security. That if people are starting to slip and type.com or whatever, and here it is, like I've owned some domains that have I set up a catch-all for them, and folks are sending credit card information
Yeah.
in email, and I'm like, ooh, well, that's dangerous. Or they're sending private information, internal information that should not be exposed, and it's just misdirected because this company doesn't own their matching.com. So all of that to say, I mean, so I think it really depends on a given situation. Likely, I mean, you have to kind of take in hand of what is your industry, what's the likelihood of someone coming along to, I guess, dethrone you from having that opportunity to secure brand protection in the .com. So, I mean, that being said, I mean, let's kind of move on here in terms of some of the uh, .io domains that are skyrocketing in price. Now, you mentioned, probably a couple minutes ago or 10 minutes or so, about .co. Now, that's a new service offering that I guess hasn't always been there, correct?
That is true. So we launched .co backorders about almost a month ago. I think it's been either a few weeks or a month ago, which is great. I mean, it's one of those things where people have always been asking for it. And to be honest, we just never, I mean, I mentioned at the very beginning of this, before I came on board, Mike was already, juggling so many things at once that he just didn't have time to implement it, despite the fact that, it was one of those things that we were constantly getting emails about. And so it's great for me because I mean, if you want to contact me, you can get me through the support because I handle most of our support emails. And it's one of those things where I don't have to answer those questions anymore. Like now, all these constant requests for .co backorders have been fulfilled. Now you just go and just start ordering. Stop asking for it and just start back ordering the domains.
And is that some? So you offer .io, .co, what else? .gg or?
So it's about 20. I think our current number is around 20, but the ones that are really popular, I mean, .io is obviously our bread and butter. .co, I would guess, is probably going to end up being somewhere in the top 3. I mean, right now it's so new. Like, there's a period of people actually realizing we actually offer it. But then .to is actually really popular, primarily because there's not very many people that do it. Like, it's essentially just us and this other company. .ly used to be really popular. It still is, but it's like you're talking about domain hacks. There's a lot of really fun domain hacks. We actually have a user that has an obscene number of I mean, he's basically like the definitive .ly guy. He does very well in .ly. So I won't say that it's kind of too late for .ly because there are still a lot of great .ly that drop, but that guy definitely got in whenever you wanted to get in for LY, because he's got some really fantastic domain hacks and just like great, funny LY domains in general. VC is another one that I think, I mean, they're very tiered, right? So like
Right.
.io, .co, those are clearly kind of in their own tier. And then there's another kind of grouping with .ly, .me, .vc, and then .gg is kind of creeping up there. And then there's just a lot of other, like, so .mn, .bc. I mean, like, there's a ton.
Dot TV.
So we don't offer TV yet. We're thinking about it's weird because so there's this 800-pound gorilla in the room that I won't necessarily mention, but they do .tv, which kind of makes it impossible for
Right.
everyone else to do .tv.
No, that's fair.
So
That's fair.
we've considered it. It's just it's not clear that we would be competitive only because we don't have hundreds of registrars.
Right. Right. Now what's interesting to me about this registration prices. They are
Yeah,
not in line with what a .com is.
no. So
So
and they fluctuate for every ccTLD is different as far as how much it costs because and it's dictated by the registry, and then the registrars can do whatever markup they want to do. But even with, I mean, because the there's obviously there's that's one of the big kind of scandals, right? Is the .com potential increase, and then there was the drama with the .org with
right.
it potentially being bought by a private equity firm, and then I guess hopefully they backed out.
Yeah,
Hopefully that
yeah,
doesn't.
that has been squashed.
Yeah, so hopefully that doesn't reemerge because that is one potential downside, right? Like it depends on your perspective because you do so for .io. I think I mean we keep pricing fairly simple, like because all of ours are some level of premium expired domains, and so every domain, if you were the only one that back orders it, it's $99 for every ccTLD, just to make it super easy for everybody. Like you don't have to think about it; it's just 99 for everything. But if you have a lot of ccTLDs and you plan on holding them for a period of time, there are registrars out there that are more kind of oriented towards just bare price, like the bare bones, as cheap as you can find it type of thing. Like they don't offer as many services, but like that's kind of their niche is they want to offer the lowest prices possible, primarily for people that want to hold a large portfolio for an extended period of time. A lot of our users, I mean, we do have users that keep their domains with us, but we're primarily focused on you want to get this domain that's expiring, you get it from
Right.
us, and then in a lot of cases, like a lot of our power users have kind of their favorite registrar that they've got thousands of domains with, and so they'll come to us, they'll get premium domains, and then in a lot of cases they'll transfer them because they want to keep them all in the same house basically. Because I can imagine, like if you have thousands of domains, it's a nightmare to try to manage them across multiple different platforms.
And so then in terms of like cost wise, obviously you say $99, but then I'm just starting to think about the renewal of just each of those because that thing, I mean, I think when I looked at it, .ai was something like $100 a year. I don't recall what .o was. I think .co, at least within where I'm purchasing from, is like 30 some odd dollars a year to renew. And so it's across the board, but I think that also probably plays a role in terms of some of these prices skyrocketing as well as just the competition because you're not just out there registering or buying up any and everything. It truly, these are popular names.
Yeah, and it also, I mean, like we were talking about earlier, that is somewhat of the downside, right? Like if so, let's use the exo.io example since
Right.
that's like what Amar was talking about with the .com. If let's say hypothetically exo.com was like a $2 million domain, if you can't pay that $2 million, then obviously you'd prefer to pay the 20,000 for the IO. The only downside is like you are probably gonna have to pay a little bit higher renewal fee, right? Like so you get a huge savings up front, and then a marginal amount that you're gonna have to pay for renewing. But in most cases, it's not that big of a deal, right? I mean, because especially if you're planning to, like if you're an investor especially and you're planning to to get the kind of return you can expect for a lot of these really high quality ccTLD domains.
Right.
I mean, we've got a statistics page on our site. I think it's just park.io/statistics, where we it's constantly updated. Like, it updates basically every month, and it will show you for publicly available data like what kind of flips we've been able to identify based on domains that were originally purchased from park.io and then eventually were flipped on some public forum. And our average return on investment is somewhere around like 1,000%. Meaning,
Wow.
like, if I spent, and I think like the maximum is something like 10,000. I mean, it's crazy. I mean, because in a lot of cases, people will buy these domains for the $99 and then turn around and flip them for $1,000, $2,000, whatever. And so whenever you've got that kind of a buffer, you can deal with a little bit higher renewal fees just because you're expecting to get a much bigger exit whenever you get out from under these domains, because you're getting in at such a low price, right? Like, that's the thing that I guess a lot of people that are in the .com world aren't familiar with as much, just because the days when that was happening in .com were, like the .com bubble, like back in the late 90s was the last time you were able to get like really premium .coms for the type of prices that you can get these premium ccTLDs. And so it's just interesting. It's almost like a reset, right? Like, in a lot of ways,
Right.
in terms of you almost get to experience what it was like for the good old boys, like the ones that were here from the beginning of the internet. It's not a lot. I mean, it's not the exact same, right? Like, I'm not at all going to tell you that you're going to flip a .com for $1 million in the foreseeable, in the near term. But on an ROI perspective, I mean, like, if you look at the amount that you had invested in the domain, you can absolutely expect to get a much bigger return than you would have if you put in a huge amount on a .com.
Right. And I guess, to that, you actually brought a good point up, is that if you are buying these domains now, in Amar's case, he's probably, I mean, he can afford to do that in terms of shelling out 20,000, and he can hold on to it. Or at least you better hope he should be able to do something like that. But in most cases, it's kind of what you were pointing to in terms of the statistics. Most people probably aren't holding these for, I would imagine, a number of years. It's a matter of probably weeks, and in some cases, or rather months, and in some cases weeks.
Yeah, I mean, and just like with everything, right? It's just a matter of kind of what your risk appetite is and like what your actual strategy is. So we have users, especially in some of the the less popular ccTLDs, so like .ag and .sc, they get like really premium domains, right? Like, so like money.ag or like forex.ag, like things that would have obscene cost per click and that get obscene traffic, but they're
Right.
on a much less popular ccTLD. So they'll get those and they'll flip them really quickly, right? Like, they'll pay nothing and then they'll flip them for a few $100s. And that's great for them. Like, that's their strategy, is they just want to have huge volume, just keep getting these incredibly great keywords at dirt cheap prices and then flip them for 3 or 4 times what they paid. And that's what they do. I mean, like, and they have constant volume because the keywords are so great. And then you have people that are kind of closer to, I mean, I don't know that Amar has one strategy. I mean, Amar's kind of on that, he's an anomaly. Like, he's
Right.
a professional's professional. But you have people that are closer to him that kind of have more of the just premium domain strategy, where they just want to have the best of the best, and they don't really care so much about getting really, really cheap and inexpensive domains that they then flip for maybe for, like, they're looking for like these big home run type sales.
Right.
You have like just a big spectrum, right? I don't really consider myself an investor because I know a lot about ccTLDs, but I waved bye to the .com a long time ago just because I don't have .com money. And so I could tell you all about like the different investment strategies for ccTLDs, but I don't know necessarily, I guess, what the best way to make money in .coms is these days.
Gotcha. Gotcha. So then, in terms of like COVID, I mean, has COVID impacted Park.io any, or just
So
has business been normal as usual?
it's interesting. Like, you and I have talked about this a little bit, but in March, like when things got really, I mean, things have been crazy obviously for months now, but when things were at kind of the peak of craziness, which, like, when I described it, when the NBA shut down, I feel like is when kind of the world was on fire as far
It
as
got
just
real.
everything was nuts. And so that's whenever the stock market had its low and everything kind of collided at once. When that happened, we saw a noticeable drop as far as transactions and kind of what people were doing and activity. But then, very much like the stock market, as soon as things rebounded, it rebounded with us as well. I mean, like everything kind of rubber banded right back to where it was. And so the short answer is it had a very small impact, which is kind of surprising. I mean, I know you have a theory, which I don't want to steal it from you, which I think might actually explain kind of why things did rebound as quickly as they did. But it honestly has not been as devastating as I thought it would be, which is also kind of echoes what's happened with the stock market. Like when I look at the stock market, I'm still kind of flabbergasted because it doesn't correlate with what's going on really with the rest of the world.
Right, right. And the theory, so for listeners, the theory that Steve is talking about is one of the things that happen, obviously, in terms of sports betting is real big throughout the world. And so obviously when you have the NBA stop, when you have football, baseball, everything stops. Well, that money has to go somewhere. Somebody, if that's their thing, gambling is their thing, likely is the case, they have an itch that needs to be scratched. So they're going to do something. So that money shifted from, Vegas, the bookies, it had to go somewhere, and likely is the case. I'm not going to say that all of it went into domains, but likely a percentage of it did. But a good percentage of that went in probably playing the stocks. And so now, and at this time of this recording, it's July 1st. So the first half of the 2020 is in the books, and we're starting the second half. And so I think we're going to see, obviously, as things begin to relax a little bit, and who knows? I mean, at this time of the recording, everybody's trying to open up, but yet they're trying to shut back down again. I think where things may head is that money's going to come out, and it's going to go back if and should sports teams, leagues open back up, that money's going to shift out. And so the reality now becomes, okay, is a percentage of the money that was basically placed in domain, is that going to also shift outward? And are we going to see a downturn at some point? I don't know, is my answer. I really don't know what we're going to see, based on things like bar sell of jackpot. I'm like, shoot, man, this thing, it's like musical chairs, and the music is not stopping anytime soon, is what it seems like.
Yeah, and so that does bring an interesting point because, well, two things, right? Like, I'm glad you mentioned we are recording this on July 1st. Whenever you're listening to this, who knows? I mean, I don't want to talk about the real news because it's kind of depressing, but any number of things could happen between this very moment and when you're actually listening to this. So if I've made any type of procrastinations, take it with a grain of salt, because I mean, I have no clue what's going to happen tomorrow or whenever I mean, Park.io hopefully will still be doing as well as it is right this second, 6 months from now or whatnot. But to your point, I think another thing that's interesting, and I haven't really done a lot of analysis on this, so I mean, this is all speculation, but I think it's also entirely possible that a lot of investors recognize that there might not be as much competition right now. And so, because I haven't broken down, like our site obviously has two big, I mean, it's three components, but two big components. One is the back ordering. I mean, just because I never even really explained how the site works. If you go and you order and you're the only person that orders and we get the domain for you, then you have the domain.
Right.
If multiple people order it and we get it, then it goes to auction. And so you have kind of a back ordering component and then you have an auctioning component. I haven't looked at the data to see, like, are we getting more back orders? Are we getting more auction traffic? Like, but it's entirely possible that a lot of the like more professional investors are scooping up a lot of domains right now because they realize there's not as many people to compete against, right? Like if you're like I mean, again, I'm not going to speak for Amar. I don't know if Amar's done this, but if I was an Amar or one of these big guys and I know long-term these domains are going to be more valuable, now to me would be just like the stock market, right? Like if you saw the stock market crash and you thought, oh, great, this is a huge buying opportunity, that's how you should treat the domains right now, right? Like if you think
Right.
other people are going to bail, now's the time to scoop them all up because they're going to be, if you think they're going to be worth a lot, like I do, 2 years, 5 years, whatever from now, you might as well get them now while there's less competition potentially, and then reap the benefit whenever everybody comes back into the market. But again, I don't know. I mean, all I know is that our numbers have rebounded significantly. I don't know if it's the gambling hypothesis like you mentioned, or if it's what I'm talking about, or if it's a combination of both, or if it's just somebody, so like some secret money bags people that I'm unaware of that are just propping up the whole thing. And if that is the case, please contact me after this, because I'd love to know more people that have money bags.
When it all falls down, Kanye West says.
You know it.
Oh
Look
man,
at you,
so
man. Seriously, this podcast, we've had a Shirtown reference. We just had a Kanye. Like I don't. If this isn't the most popular podcast of all time, I don't know what your audience wants.
how Texas was even mentioned.
Seriously, I've even like the fact that I even dropped a Texoma reference, which literally nobody. I mean, I don't know. Hopefully so. Hopefully there's someone out there that is from Texoma. Reach out to both of us. We can
Exactly.
have a Texoma reunion podcast.
Exactly. Everybody go Google how Texas. It'll be the joy of your life. It'll make be the joy of your day, your week, your month, probably the second half of 2020. Oh my goodness. No, so man, it's interesting. There was one more thing there that it made me think about in terms of just when we talk about where things are headed. And like you said, we don't know what's going to happen. Things could, go to pieces, and who knows what may happen. But the reality is, at least from what we know, if you, I kind of look at it and say, invest in what you know for one.
Yeah, absolutely.
Don't go on the hype. Yes, you can go see the Amars, the bars of the world, man, and that just rhymed. There we go. I'm back to rhyming. I might start
I love
rapping
it.
in a minute. Who knows?
I hope so. You already mentioned Kanye. I mean,
Freestyling.
we're ready to go.
So, but when you start looking at, I think you really have to take into consideration that this isn't going to all. We hope that this remains the same, but the reality is these things, and .co is probably a great example, because at one time it was on fire.
Yeah.
And then, it's the ebbs and flows, probably of registry life, if I can, or registrar life. It's the ccTLD life. It comes and it goes in ebbs and flows. And so you have to kind of watch it. You can't take this podcast and literally just go out there and begin to blindly register or think that you're going to have lightning in a bottle to stumble up on 3, 4, 5-figure sales. It's just not likely is the case. There are more carcasses along the way than there are standing at the end. Is likely the best way that I put it. And so, I mean, with that, Steve, shoot, man, we're like out of time, but I certainly thank you, man, for taking time, out of your busy day to come from behind the curtain and join us today, man.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a blast. Anytime
Yeah.
we can talk about how Texas, I mean, that's how you get me on a podcast.
Exactly. And before we go, though, there are two questions that I want to leave you with, to leave the listeners with, and hopefully, you can answer this. And I know that there are likely folks that are out there going, okay, well, what would be your advice to them if they're starting their journey in domain investing and specifically investing in ccTLDs? Where should they begin?
So I would dovetail into what you just said, right? Like, so if you're just starting out, you need to be really honest with yourself and recognize kind of what you know and then what you don't know, and then understand that there's a lot that you don't even know that you don't know, and really focus in on what you know and get really niche with it, right? Like if you're a domain expert in, some specific topic, then focus on that whenever you start doing domaining, right? Like figure out how to appraise domains that are very much connected to the topic that you're already a professional in or you're an expert in. Or, and when I say expert, I mean, I say very loosely, right? Like you'd be surprised how easy it is to become very knowledgeable about something and then instantly become more knowledgeable than most people about a given topic. And so just kind of stay within what you already know before you start branching out and trying to become the next Amar. Like I in no way want to dissuade you. I mean, everybody can become an Amar or a Bar or an Alvin. And it's just a matter of kind of figuring out what it is that you already know and then building on it and then just learning. And then, because especially with ccTLDs, like it's not an overstatement to say that there really is a lot of opportunity still. There's a lot of places that haven't been exploited, which is not a negative term. It's just there's a lot of opportunity that people haven't really discovered yet, just because it's not nearly as well known as .coms. And so there's if you're just starting out, obviously I have a vested interest in .io and all the other ccTLDs, but it really is a much easier place to start, just because the competition's much lower, the entry prices are much lower. You're going to make mistakes no matter what you do in the very beginning. And so it's a lot cheaper to make mistakes in ccTLDs than it is to start just dropping 4 or 5 figures on .coms and then realizing I didn't really know what I was doing. Like that was a bad decision. Like for that price, you could make a lot of terrible decisions and still end up coming out even or ahead, just because, what is the expression? A blind squirrel. I have no idea. I'm terrible with cliches.
A clock is right.
The clock is right. Yeah, a broken clock's right at least twice a day. There you go. Thank you.
Exactly.
See, this is how we do. Like if we didn't have the Shirtown connection, there's no way that Alvin would have given me that lifeline. I would have just been like floundering, talking about blind squirrels and finding nuts and whatever. But fortunately, there it is. Yes, broken clock.
Oh my goodness, kindred spirits.
So good.
Oh my goodness. Well, last but not least, is there anything you would like to share with listeners? I mean, obviously, hey, folks are probably going to want to know how to get in contact with you, whether on social, whether it's through park.io. I mean, how and what should they do to get in contact with you?
If you want to know anything about park.io, just send a message to support. So support@park.io. It will get to me. I will have something goofy to say in one way or another. If you want to find me on Twitter, I'm at Steve Webb, so just at my name, which is actually a funny story in itself, and I'll just say 5 seconds. There's a much more popular Steve Webb. He's a politician in the UK. People are constantly complaining about his policies. They send it to me because I have the at Steve Webb, only because I knew a guy that worked at Twitter, and so he got me the name before the politician. And so you can get me on Twitter, but it's more likely you can get me on email. Just send support@park.io or steve@park.io, and I will answer any questions. And one more quick thing. We do not have time to go into this at all, but maybe we'll do another podcast 6 months from now. If you're interested in Handshake or like any type of alternative TLDs or what I would call the new internet, go to gateway.io. It's just gateway, like the defunct computers from the 90s.
Oh, man.
And
the cows on the side.
There, yeah, you can learn but that's a whole other animal. Like there's some kind of brain breaking stuff that Mike and I are working on, but it's not directly related to park.io. But if you go to gateway.io, it'll be an entry point to all of that insanity.
That is awesome, man. Well, again, like I said, we're out of time. So thank you, man, for joining us today and sharing your domain in industry and entrepreneurial experience.
Thank you. You're the best.
Well, thank you. And listeners, thank you for tuning in to Kickstart Commerce, where we share search marketing and domain investing strategies to help grow your business. Please subscribe to this podcast via iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify, or Podbean. Last but not least, please visit kickstartcommerce.com to subscribe to the newsletter sharing tips and tricks about the disciplines of digital strategy. Thanks, and that's all for now.